Good afternoon, Rabbi Moskowitz. Thank you for joining us again with TribeHerald.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much for having me.
So recently, we've been getting comments from some homophobic people on TikTok using terms like committing gay, using terms like committing gay, as if being gay is a crime, committing gay sex, committing gay relations. Um, is the act of intimacy between two gay men a crime?
A crime is for sure not the right language. People are who they are. What people decide to do with each other is dependent on the context. Judaism expects, consent and honesty, transparency, safety in all types of intimate relationships, regardless of whether or not it's between two men or two women or people who are genderqueer. So there's no crime in being. And unfortunately, because of that posture of homophobia, the real crime is when somebody is forced to deny their own queer identity, marry straight, and invariably is deceitful and deceptive and dishonest in being unfaithful to their spouse to be with somebody that they're actually attracted to.
Unfortunately, it seems like whenever halacha is brought up, whenever Jewish law is brought up in an LGBT context, the video turns into OnlyFans. Everyone all has questions about sexual relations. Why do you think there's this emphasis on sexual relations when it comes to gay people, as if identity can be reduced to one thing?
It's very strange. I don't know. Being straight doesn't mean that you're attracted to everybody of the opposite gender. And, within Jewish thought, these are meant to be kind of private moments of intimacy. So the obsession with what's going on behind closed doors is very strange. I don't know if it's voyeuristic by nature, that people themselves have their own proclivities, and like this is a way in which they can experience it vicariously. I don't know whether it's just a move to try to marginalize and shame people, to make people feel dirty for being attracted to somebody the way in which straight people are attracted to people. I don't know, but the obsession part is very strange.
Moving a little bit on to a slightly unrelated topic, another question that we've been getting is that a lot of people are involved in interfaith relationships, and a lot of people are involved in multi-faith families. Should Jews who are in interfaith relationships be welcomed into the Jewish community?
Absolutely. There needs to be a recognition that dating or marrying somebody who is not Jewish is not the same statement that it was traditionally, and therefore the response of rabbis in those generations, when it was a proactive move to remove oneself from a Jewish community, so that needs to shift, because today a person is dating somebody, a person marries somebody who's not Jewish. That's not at all a reflection on how they feel about their own Jewish identity or their commitment to the Jewish people. And that is a move that has shifted, just as the world has shifted. And so we do need to have new conversation and new language for what it means to be supportive and inclusive. But a person wants to be part of the Jewish community, a person wants to come to synagogue, when it's safe, and a person wants to be involved in Jewish communal affairs. Everybody should be encouraged to do so and supported, as we see the space of the complexity of the variations of different family dynamics continues to evolve. So we as a community need to be supportive and sensitive and learn about what that looks like in new ways.
And now, by extension, should people with a Jewish father, should patrilineal Jews be accepted into the Jewish community?
So when we think about Jewish community, I think it's actually much broader than people want to acknowledge, and it's not new. We've always had people who were kind of aligned with the community and maybe held many different identities. The person has Jewish or non-Jewish relatives, but they're part of one's family. So by extension, that's part of the Jewish community, because by extension, the individual's community and family is very much a part of their existence. So when we think about community, I think it's much broader than any individual identity.
Well, for the purposes of synagogues, should patrilineal Jews be considered Jews?
So different movements have answered this question, and some have struggled, with it. Gender, egalitarianism even in the conservative movement, limits Jewish identity to matrilineal descent. The Reform movement holds that that is not a place where gender makes a difference. So if parents, regardless of gender identity, and the truth is, even within with Orthodoxy, it's expanding. That if you, let's say, you have a man of trans experience, so you have a man who's assigned female, transitions, gives birth. So there might be space also to acknowledge that matrilineal descent has nothing to do perhaps with a female identity and more about the person who actually gives birth. So I think in those spaces, the conversation is evolving, but in most places, the different movements have drawn their own lines about what they see reaches the threshold of Jewish identity based on parents' identity.
We've been seeing a lot of people referring to Baruch Hashem, my profile, and other Jewish creators' profiles on TikTok as a safe space, that they feel safe in a Jewish context because maybe in a Christian context or in a non-Jewish context, they may have been attacked for being gay or been attacked for being trans. Do you think that that Judaism provides that idea of a safe space, that idea of safety, of sanctuary from outside prejudice?
A sanctuary, by definition, literally is a safe space, a place to find sanctuary, to be the most authentic and genuine version of oneself in relationship to God. Tradition teaches us that if we exclude people from that space based on their identities, so then God doesn't show up, because God refuses to show up to a place of exclusivity like that.
And now, in a little bit of and also on another tangent,
Sure.
we had spoken before about, Adam and the first person being either intersex or non-binary, depending on how we read the verse. Is God non-binary?
Well, God, I think, is the source of all gender. God certainly has gendered attributes, and God doesn't have a body. So when we think about being created in the image of God, a God that has no image, there's a recognition that I think gender has its source on a soul level.
Okay. So being the source of all gender, I guess, would make one non-binary by definition.
Certainly God doesn't exist in just the binary of male-female. That is for sure true. And there are all sorts of attributes of God that exist on a spectrum that are not necessarily gendered. Some are more gendered than others, right? The idea of God as being compassionate or merciful comes from the Bala Rachman, comes from the Hebrew rechem, which means womb. Right? There's an aspect of giving birth, hamakom yinachim, that the omnipresent can console. Hamakom also is a euphemism for parts of the anatomy. So there's certainly gendered connections there. The divine presence, the Shekhinah, is also skews feminine, where we have also masculine identities of God of war and vengeance and those types of things. But they're not meant to be this to the exclusion of that. That one of the ways in which we differ from God is that God is singular. God is everything all the time in all the places. We, because we occupy a physical and finite space, often find tension for a dominant expression of this to the exclusion of that. I'm sitting in this chair to the exclusion of all other chairs. So there's often competition that exists for us in the manifestation of those attributes, where by God, there's a profound simplicity that is what's one of the things that separates us from God.
I'm sorry for all the rapid fire questions today,
from
all the different, drastically different points of view.
It's all good.
Is drag forbidden in Judaism?
It's a great question. There is a biblical verse of wearing misgendered clothing, but a condition for that prohibition is when a person is using that dress to misrepresent oneself in order to gain access to gendered and intimate spaces. So it's most analogous to a person who's not a doctor pretending to be a doctor to gain access to patients. So there's nothing wrong with being a doctor. There's nothing wrong with dressing up as a doctor. The problem becomes when you're not a doctor and you pretend to be one. So in terms of drag, the prohibition biblically of wearing misgendered clothing is to misrepresent oneself in order to gain access with nefarious or licentious intentions. So if it's clear that the drag is some sort of performance, if it's an art form, so then it's definitely not biblically forbidden. And then it's a judgment call whether or not this is something that a person feels contributes in some ways spiritually. But it's brought down in the Code of Jewish Law that it's permissible to wear misgendered clothing on Purim. There's even a custom to do so. And so there is no biblical prohibition, and even sometimes it's appropriate. So a person wants to dress up in drag on Purim. I think a person could make an argument there that it's in line with the themes of the day. And then for kind of year-round activity, it's a function of art and performance. The things that we have to be sensitive to is being deceptive. If we identify as one gender, but we go around as another in order to trick people, so then that's something that the Torah speaks very harshly about.
At what point should a trans person be considered the gender as which they identify? Is it a matter of self-identification? Do we wait for a transition? At what point is a trans woman a woman or a trans man a man?
There's a meta question about where gender exists and if we can pinpoint a specific place along that spectrum of transition, which is so person specific. I don't know that we have access to that information. The practical answer is that when a person says they want a new set of pronouns, we should use that new set of pronouns. When a person starts identifying as a gender that perhaps requires a community to affirm or validate in terms of separate seating, at the moment where the individual has a need or an ask or want, a desire, so that's then becomes the communal responsibility to affirm that, even if we haven't yet answered the meta question of where along that place of transition. For some people it is name changes. For other people it's it's a wardrobe change or haircut. For others it's hormones, and for others it's surgery. To replace kind of a halachic structure or definition of gender with a social one or vice versa, it doesn't advance the cause of making sure that every person is able to be who they are in relationship to God in communal spaces. So for some people, there's a clear moment where they have a recognition of a gender identity, and there's a process of transitioning. For others, it's a moment of transitioning. For some people, it is ongoing, and there's kind of a fluidity to gender identity. And so it's important to recognize the uniqueness of each person's life, lived experience. Nobody's life is ever hypothetical. And so really, like in all aspects of allyship, it's important to be in relationship with and to be able to listen and to be able to hear the needs of the individual that will often shift in the moment.
So that sounds like it would vary from congregation to congregation, depending on the person.
From person to person, yeah. I mean, congregations need to be on the receiving end of listening and be proactive to make sure that they're constantly checking in with the people that they're trying to support to understand what that looks like in the moment. And that can shift. If a person is transitioning from, one gender to another in terms of the binaries, so making sure that there's bathroom access. If somebody is gender queer and wants all gender bathrooms or separate stall bathrooms, so there might be different different needs depending on the transition. But especially in communities that have a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice, the needs can vary depending on the stage of transition. Certainly as soon as a person is presenting as the gender in which they identify as, then it's important to be able to use this space, gendered space, to affirm that new pronounced identity.
Should we see more women-identified people in positions of leadership in the Orthodox community? We see lots of cis and trans men, in positions of leadership. Do you think that there's going to eventually be a space for women en masse teaching in the Orthodox community?
I certainly hope so, and there are a few. They're not. They don't necessarily get the fame or the platform yet, but there's certainly people who have transitioned that are in positions of leadership. I think the space of women's leadership in general is shifting. It's shifting very quickly. You now have women who are involved in Daf Yomi, right? I was last year in Israel. It was like 3,000 women who were part of this Siyum Hashas. So I think as the space for women's leadership and women teaching expands and becomes more mainstream, invariably then we'll have women of trans experience in that space as well.
You mentioned, women doing Daf Yomi. Is there an issue with women learning Gemara?
The tradition that I have is that there were always individuals who were learning the oral law, who were studying Talmud, that the pushback was really about formalizing that education. And, as women's education has shifted in the world, it's important to recognize that Judaism needs to be able to accommodate the needs and the opportunities of people in each generation. So we are seeing a huge influx of access, to the information, and as a result, we're seeing women in postures of creative production, I think, at a rate that we haven't ever seen. It's also important to remember that the struggles for women's liberation and is still ongoing in terms of pay equality. We now have a vice president-elect who's a woman, but there are other places where we haven't made progress. The vote is relatively recent, and there's still issues in basically every area of society where women are not given access the way in which men still are.
Again, with the rapid fire questions from various different points of view.
All good.
Recently, we just had a conversation on YouTube where privilege, the idea of benefiting from privilege, voluntarily benefiting from privilege, was referred to as anti-Torah. Is privilege in itself, is benefiting from privilege anti the will of God?
It's a great question. I think there are very few things that are intrinsically good or bad. It's a function of what we use it for. As somebody who's cis, as straight, as white, as rabbinically educated, there is privilege in that which I attempt to harness as an ally to do the good work. So I think when we talk about privilege, the question is, how are we using it? So if we use it to benefit ourselves, right, to hoard and to be selfish and to take more, especially at the expense of those who don't even have adequate amounts, so then that itself is deeply unholy and against the tradition. But leveraging the privilege in order to be able to network it to the needs, that's what privilege is for. And so there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's absolutely a mitzvah. When we think about allyship as spiritual practice, if a person doesn't have resources, if they don't have a certain kind of access or privilege or platform or agency, so then it's not possible to be an ally. So again, I think the question is to what extent a person is using it for the greater good, as opposed to the selfish consumption.
It sounds like allyship is not just a good thing to do. It's like it's a chiyuv. It's something one must.
It's an obligation. That's right.
And not just.
That's right. We are obligated to be allies.
Right. Not just for. Okay. To actually quantify this, what mitzvahs does one perform by being an ally besides just ahavat Yisrael, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha?
Sure. So those, loving another like we love ourselves are not small things. Even if it was just that, it would be a tremendous accomplishment. Being an ally is really about being in relationship with God. If we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, we need to love all of God's children as our siblings. So if we want to be part of the Jewish people, if we want to be part of humanity, if somebody is suffering, we need to feel that personally. And if there's something that we can do about it to alleviate some of that suffering, we're held responsible to the extent that we can affect something. So if a person is in a position of privilege, a person is in a position of doing something about it, they're held accountable, not just for their actions, but for their inactions.
In this week's Parsha, we find, Parsha Shemot, we're talking about, the people who came down to Egypt and they were oppressed collectively. Klal Yisrael is experiencing exile as a group. It seems like there's not that room for individualism. Do you see like these parshas coming up, Shmos, Vayera, we're talking about the story of Passover, we're talking about the story of the redemption from Egypt. It seems like allyship is kind of an ongoing theme right now. Everyone watching out for each other, everyone making sure that everyone else is, not working too hard, things like that.
Yes, the Medrash actually says the reason why Moses was worthy and meritorious of having God reveal God's self at the burning bush was because of the act of allyship that he engaged in protecting the Hebrew from the taskmaster. And the Medrash frames it really beautifully that because Moses kind of turned away from his life of privilege to be able to focus his eyes and heart on the suffering of another, then God turned away from God's business in heaven to be able to then focus on what was happening here. And that moment is really seen as the beginning of the redemption. And the rabbis tell us that today as well, that the reason why the world is so broken is because we have separated people and dehumanized them, and there's blatant hatred. So when we're willing to feel the pain of another and make ourselves part of that collective, so then God is willing to also kind of reunite and be part of that redemptive process.
That idea of the baseless hatred that would destroy the second temple, what do we see? It seems like homophobia, racism, transphobia, all of these are reincarnations of that. How can we how do we fight this baseless hatred? How do I react to homophobia? How do we fight the baseless hatred, those of us who are in these categories?
The best way to respond to microaggressions is with microaffections. And when we think about the macro affections that we have the capacity to give by, showering the world with love and really promoting inclusivity and acceptance and doing all of the things to be able to banish that hatred and that darkness by being the light, then good and truth and love always wins out.
But that's hard to do. When one.
Of course, it's hard to do. It's been,
is the target.
The first temple was the first temple. The rabbis tell us was destroyed for the 3 cardinal sins, and we were punished with 70 years of exile. And now, 2,000 years later, we're still suffering because of what seemingly, ostensibly, is this small thing of baseless hatred. And the rabbis explained that it's not a punishment as much as it's a consequence. That God will always be in the closet as long as we make it impossible for people to be able to be out as who they are. So the work of creating a safe space isn't just about other people, it's about creating a safe space for God.
So to continue, is there an obligation for forgiveness on behalf of the LGBT community towards homophobia?
I think it's always hard to ask those who have been oppressed and weighted by the trauma of that oppression to dig deeper to forgive. But if a person is able to, and perhaps relieve themselves from some of that, from the weight of carrying it, I think it's good for the universe. The person never loses out by being mevater, by forgiving, especially when people are willing to change their ways and it can advance the cause. So we don't need to compromise on the expectations we have for human dignity or to expect a recognition of the pain and the suffering that's been caused by generations of homophobia. But if a person is willing to rise above it, in our tradition also there's an idea of going high, particularly when they go low.
Is a transition into one's identity, is transition something to celebrate? Should transition be celebrated with a kiddush or something like that?
When a person is true to self, there's a manifestation of the divine truth as well, and that is something to be celebrated. We celebrate a person who transitions into Judaism. Someone who's a Jew by choice is a transition. It's a recognition that on a soul level, a person really was connected to that identity even before the transition. When a person returns to Judaism, even though they were born Jewish, we celebrate the Baal Tshuva as the one who's returned. And I think when it comes to a transition of gender identity, letting the world know who a person is at the core is something to be able to celebrate and to embrace. And the world is slowly coming to.
Unfortunately, we got cut off on that last question, but moving on to one last issue that's been coming up. Basically, should gay people that are promiscuous, that are obviously engaging in all types of things, should gay people that are promiscuous be included in the congregation, be counted as part of a minyan, things like that?
I don't see it being any different than a person who's straight and being promiscuous. Judaism very much believes in exclusivity around intimacy, certainly in traditional kind of settings. So if a person is kind of out and about, Judaism sees a higher level of happiness and pleasure being attained in quantity being replaced with a quality relationship, but being queer has nothing to do with it. If somebody is straight, we would encourage them, to also kind of rein it in and, be able to focus on developing kind of the deepening of a relationship.
Nobody has carte blanche in Judaism to do whatever they want.
it's one of, I don't know, again, there's a strange obsession with wanting to be curious about the queer experience in ways that parallel the straight experience. You know, there are people who go and try to find pleasure in superficial, and so that is just something by its very nature that requires time, and most people have a hard time focusing on one person properly in a relationship. So I think traditionally that has always been the model, and there is something stereotypically I think problematic in assuming that queer folks are promiscuous when straight folks have the same kind of proclivities, and it's a part of being human. It's not a function of sexual orientation.
And one last thing that's come up in this parsha, this week's parsha, Parshat Shemot, is the parsha of names.
Yes.
And in this week's parsha, God gives Moses a name to say. When Moses says, "What am I going to say your name is?" Hashem responds with an accessible name, because he said that he was slow of lips and tongue, so he gave him a name that only involved breath, Ekyeh. This idea of names and of God giving their new name, what messages of chizuk do you think that the trans community specifically, but the LGBT community in general, can get from this week's parsha?
There's a lot here that's really supportive of the recognition that a name represents often a person's mission in this world. Moses is called Moses. This is an Egyptian name, but God calls him by it because it means that he was drawn from the water, and as a result, his life is really, on some level, a gift that he should appreciate, that naturally he wouldn't have survived. And because he was miraculously saved, his life really belongs more than most to the broader good. So when we think about transitioning, it's important for a person to recognize who they are for themselves, but more importantly, it's important to know who we are for other people. And so name changes often recognize the work that a person has to then do for the outside world, recognizing their unique gifts and offerings to society.
When a person transitions, do they change their Hebrew name also?
It's very much person specific. Sometimes people have names that are, not gendered. And sometimes, just like in English, there's certain names that, are able to be both genders. So it's very much a person specific type of choice. It's not obligatory, but many people find it not just ceremonial, but also very tangible, that it marks the transition, and as a result, being that the name represents the essence of a person, that it's appropriate when a person recognizes a different essence to be able to have that reflected in a name as well.
And one last question. When someone converts to Judaism, should they be recognized as the gender with which they identify at the time of conversion?
Absolutely. Even if a person doesn't convert, people should always identify other people's genders the way in which they identify, but particularly around conversion, which is a gender-based spiritual practice. There's a different ask for men and for women. And it's a little bit more complicated that sometimes it's really about body parts and not about gender, but those are very much kind of the cutting edge questions that society is dealing with, and how to be affirming and supportive of gender identity around conversions.
And God willing, we will see the point at which everyone in Klal Yisrael is accepted, regardless of gender identity or orientation.
That's right. God willing. Amen. Kenny Heraldson.
Amen. Thank you so
much. Right, my friends. Always a pleasure. Looking forward to next week.
All right.